Busted or slow leaking kite bladders can really cut into your sessions. Doesn't have to be that way though. Today we're going to break down the process of showing you how to remove, repair, and reinstall both the leading edge as well as the struts. So let's get started, because there's supposed to be wind and waves today and we definitely don't want to miss that. A couple of key things that we just want to point out first, and one is to make sure that you do this kind of an enclosed environment, out of the weather, preferably indoors. There are some small parts to keep track of, so we're just here in the loft and we're going to run you through this process. The other assumption is that you already know where the leak is. If you haven't already done so, pump up the kite, fully inflated, pinch off all the struts, let the kite sit for a little bit. If there is a slow leak somewhere, you'll know exactly where it is after 20 or 30 minutes. And so that's the one we want to deal with. No sense in taking out bladders that don't need to be repaired, right? Let's get started. First, lay out the kite with the struts facing up. Since space is usually at a premium, we'll be working on half the kite at a time. Each end of the leading edge bladder is folded over and secured with a Velcro closure. You will also find a zipper access pocket at the center of the LE. Undo each Velcro closure and unzip the center access pocket. This will open up the sleeve and allow you access to the bladder. Separate the airlock valve from the leading edge by carefully lifting the retainer ring from the bladder. The leading edge bladder is partially secured in place by a Velcro ring that runs around the perimeter of the main airlock valve opening. Using the pull tab located on the side of this Velcro ring, carefully peel back the airlock base off the inside of the LE sleeve. If the Sprint valves on your kite have neoprene base covers, go ahead and peel those back first before attempting to service or remove any of the Sprint parts. Next, disassemble the Sprint valves. Remove the tubing lock collars from the strut valves. Now loosen both screws on either side of the base collar until the part is loose enough to be removed. Be sure to keep track of all these small parts for later reinstallation. Next, gently push the valves down into the strut sleeve. Repeat this process for each strut to leading edge valve connection on that particular side of the kite. For this next step, you'll need two flying lines. Starting with one end of the leading edge, tie one line on or around the wingtip of the end of the bladder. Be sure the line you're using is long enough to travel the distance from the wingtip to the center section where the zippered opening is, with a little bit to spare. Gently pull one side of the bladder out of the sleeve at a time, leaving the flying line through the sleeve. Having the flying line through the sleeve will allow you to easily replace the bladder once it is repaired. With one side now done, you can go ahead and repeat the exact same process for the opposite side of the kite. One side of the sleeve, reattach the Sprint distribution tubes along with the air clips. Inflate the bladder and close all the clips and the airlock valve so that it maintains air. Be careful not to overinflate the bladder. Submerge the bladder in water to locate the hole. A bathtub or large sink full of water is best. You will need to submerge one section of the bladder at a time in order to locate the hole. Look for air bubbles, which will pinpoint the location of the leak. Once you've located the leak, dry the area and mark the hole with a circle. A permanent marker works best for this. Cut a slightly oversized patch from the bladder tape in your kite bag. Be sure that the area to be patched is both clean and dry. Remove the backing from the patch and press it onto the bladder, covering the hole. Be sure that there are no wrinkles underneath the patch, as air can have a tendency to slow leak from those wrinkles. Set the bladder aside for at least 20 minutes to fully cure. With the bladder patch now fully cured, one final check of submerging it underwater is always recommended before you reinstall. While you're there, be sure to check the rest of the bladder for any spots you might have missed. To help minimize bladder twisting during reinstallation, be sure to lay the leading edge completely flat and position the closing seam pointing outward as shown. Be sure to remove all the Sprint air distribution tubes and their clips. While preparing the bladder for reinstallation, an optional step while folding it in the accordion style we're showing here is to put a light dusting of talcum powder over the bladder. This will help minimize the twisting during reinstallation. With the prepping now done for one half of the bladder, repeat this process for the other half. With the bladder now prepped, orient it and lay it close to the center access pocket and tie off one end of the bladder to one of the lines that is now inside the leading edge sleeve. Feed the first inch or two into the opening. Back at the wingtip, begin gently pulling on one of the lines to start feeding the bladder back into the sleeve. Do so slowly and carefully, paying attention that the bladder is feeding back in normally. Continue pulling on the line until the sprint valves approximately line up with their respective opening. Generally, this means pulling the bladder out 6 to 8 inches past the end. Next, locate and rethread each individual sprint valve through their respective openings. Prior to seating it in place, give a gentle shake to be sure none of the bladder is being pinched. Reattach the base collar to secure the valve in place. Reattach the air distribution tube and the collar connected to the LE. The trick to proper base collar reinstallation is to slide the part down the inflation tube as far as it'll go until it stops. At this point, take a hand and stretch the inflation tube out in the opposite direction while using your other hand to continue sliding the base collar down the tube until it's flush with the valve. Finish this part by reinstalling the neoprene base collar covers if applicable to your kite. The trick to getting them back on is to start by hooking the back section and working your way around to the front of the collar as shown here. With the sprint system now reattached on this particular side, you can go ahead and reseat the main airlock valve opening by lining up the Velcro and pressing it into place. After that's done, you can simply mirror these steps for the other half of the kite. One of the final steps is to secure the bladder ends into the wingtips of the kite. Do so by tucking any excess bladder material back into the sleeve until the ends are flush with each other. Then, give the end a good shake a few times to get any excess bladder material to fall back into the main sleeve of the kite. Now, simply fold over the end and tuck it back in, and get the Velcro to reseat by pressing firmly on both sides. Finally, you can go ahead and reattach the main airlock valve by threading the retainer ring through the safety loop and gently stretching it around the bladder opening. A couple of small twists back and forth may be required to get the ring to click down into place. The moment of truth is here. Go ahead and slowly and carefully pump up the kite, checking for any twists or unusual kinks. If all looks okay, go ahead and top her off and pinch off all the sprint clips. If she holds air, you're good to go. The process for dealing with the struts is nearly identical with a couple of minor differences. The first step is to identify which strut bladder is actually leaking. From here, you'll want to fully deflate the kite, lay it on its back, and disassemble the sprint system on the strut side only. Now, tie a line around the valve. Be sure to cinch down on it tight so it doesn't come off prematurely. Gently insert the valve down into the strut sleeve. At the base of the sleeve, open up the Velcro closure. This will allow access to pull out the damaged bladder. Slowly and gently pull the bladder out of the sleeve. Detach the line and leave it laying in the sleeve. From here, the process of locating and repairing the leak is the same as the method used for the LE that we showed earlier. For reinstallation, go ahead and tie the line from the end of the strut opening back onto the valve stem. Lie the bladder flat at the end of the strut so that you may now feed it back into the sleeve. Gently feed the valve back into the strut tail opening, along with the next couple inches of bladder material. Back at the valve opening, you can now gently pull the line out of the sleeve, which will also, at the same time, pull the bladder back into place. From here, the process of completely reassembling the sprint system on this affected strut is identical to the method used for the leading edge that we showed you earlier. Now, just tuck in the end of the bladder and reseat the end of the strut sleeve, and we're ready to do a final inflation check. The final step is just like we did with the leading edge, is to slowly and carefully reinflate the kite, checking for any twists or unusual kinks, clip off all the struts, and let the kite sit for a little bit. If everything checks out, You're good to go and get back on the water.